John Wayne Gacy Jr. was an American serial killer and rapist. He sexually assaulted, tortured and murdered at least 33 teenage boys and young men between 1972 and 1978 in Cook County, Illinois, a part of metropolitan Chicago. All of Gacy's known murders were committed inside his Norwood Park ranch house. His victims were typically lured to his address by force or deception, and all but one victim were murdered by either asphyxiation or strangulation with a makeshift tourniquet. His first victim was stabbed to death. Gacy buried 26 of his victims in the crawlspace of his home. 3 further victims were buried elsewhere on his property, while the bodies of his last 4 known victims were discarded in the Des Plaines River. Convicted of 33 murders, Gacy was sentenced to death on March 13, 1980 for 12 of those killings. He spent 14 years on death row before he was finally executed by lethal injection at Stateville Correctional Center on May 10, 1994. Gacy became known as the Killer Clown because of his charitable services at fundraising events, parades, and children's parties where he would dress as Pogo the Clown, a character he devised himself. Early life. John Wayne Gacy Jr. was born in Chicago, Illinois, on March 17, 1942, the only son and second of 3 children born to John Wayne Gacy, an auto repair machinist and World War I veteran, and his wife Marion Elaine Robinson, a homemaker. Throughout his childhood, Gacy strove to make his stern father proud of him, but seldom received his approval. This friction between father and son was constant throughout his childhood and adolescence. When he was 6 years old, Gacy stole a toy truck from a neighborhood store. His mother made him walk back to the store, return the toy and apologize to the owners. His mother told his father, who beat Gacy with a belt as punishment. After this incident, Gacy's mother attempted to shield her son from his father's verbal and physical abuse. In 1949, Gacy's father was informed that his son and another boy had been caught sexually fondling a young girl. Because of a heart condition, Gacy was ordered to avoid all sports at school. Although his mother, sisters, and few close friends themselves never doubted his illness, Gacy's medical condition was never conclusively diagnosed. At the age of 18, Gacy became involved in politics, working as an assistant precinct captain for a Democratic Party candidate in his neighborhood. This decision earned more criticism from his father, who accused his son of being a patsy. The same year Gacy became a Democratic Party candidate, his father bought him out. In his role as a mortuary attendant, Gacy slept in a cot behind the embalming room. The sense of shock prompted Gacy to call his mother the next day and ask whether his father would allow him to return home. In 1964, the non-Bush Shoe Company transferred Gacy to Springfield, initially to work as a salesman. During his courtship with Marlon, Gacy joined the JCs and became a tireless worker for the organization, being named key man for the organization in April 1964. By 1965, Gacy had risen to the position of vice president of the Springfield JCs. Waterloo, Iowa. In 1966, Gacy began to manage the 3 KFC restaurants his father-in-law purchased in Waterloo. In Waterloo, Gacy joined the local chapter of the JCs, regularly offering extensive hours to the organization in addition to the 12- and 14-hour days he worked as a manager of 3 KFC restaurants. Although considered ambitious and somewhat of a braggart by his colleagues in the JCs, he was highly regarded as a tireless worker on several fundraising projects. In 1967, he was named Outstanding Vice President of the Waterloo JCs. Gacy's wife gave birth to 2 children. A son named Michael was born in February 1966, followed by a daughter named Christine in March 1967. However, there was a seedier side of Gacy life in Waterloo, one that involved wife-swapping. First offenses. In August 1967, Gacy committed his first known sexual assault upon a teenage boy. The victim was a 15-year-old named Donald Voorhees, the son of a fellow Gacy. Gacy lured the youth to his house with the promise of showing Voorhees pornographic films. In March 1968, Donald Voorhees reported to his father that Gacy had sexually assaulted him. Voorhees Sr. immediately informed the police, and Gacy was arrested and subsequently charged with oral sodomy in relation to Voorhees and the attempted assault of a 16-year-old named Edward Lynch. Gacy publicly denied any wrongdoing and insisted the charges against him were politically motivated. Voorhees Sr. had opposed Gacy's nomination for appointment as president of the Iowa Jaycees. The most striking aspect of the test results is the patient's total denial of responsibility for everything that has happened to him. He can produce an alibi for everything. He presents himself as a victim of circumstances and blames other people who are out to get him. The patient attempts to assure a sympathetic response by depicting himself as being at the mercy of a hostile environment. Quote, on August 30, 1968, Gacy persuaded one of his employees, an 18-year-old named Russell Schroeder, to physically assault Donald Voorhees in an effort to discourage the boy from testifying against him at his upcoming trial. The youth agreed to lure Voorhees to a secluded spot, spray mace in his face, and beat the youth with the promise that if he did so, he would be paid $300. In early September, Schroeder lured Voorhees to an isolated county park, sprayed the mace supplied by Gacy into the youth's eyes, then beat him, all the while shouting that he was not to testify against Gacy at his upcoming trial. Voorhees managed to get away and immediately reported the assault to the police, identifying Schroeder as his attacker. After seeing the signs of the struggle, Schroeder was arrested the following day. Despite initially denying any involvement, Schroeder confessed to having assaulted Voorhees, indicating that he had done so at Gacy's request. Gacy was arrested and additionally charged in relation to hiring Schroeder to assault and intimidate Voorhees. Conviction and imprisonment. Upon advice from his attorney, Gacy entered a plea of guilty to one count of sodomy in relation to the charges filed against him by Donald Voorhees. He pleaded not guilty to the other charges lodged against him by other youths at a formal arraignment held on November 7, 1968. Before the judge, Gacy contended that he and Voorhees had indeed engaged in sexual relations. Yet he insisted Voorhees had offered his sexual services to him and that he had acted out of curiosity. During his incarceration in the Anamosa State Penitentiary, Gacy rapidly acquired a reputation as a model prisoner. In June 1969, Gacy first applied to the state of Iowa Board of Parole for early release. This application was denied. In preparation for a second scheduled parole hearing in May 1970, Gacy completed 16 high school courses, for which he obtained his diploma in November 1969. On Christmas Day 1969, Gacy's father died from cirrhosis of the liver. Parole. Gacy was granted parole with 12 months probation. Upon his release, Gacy told a friend and fellow Gacy named Clarence Lane, who picked him up from the prison upon release and had remained steadfast in his belief of Gacy's innocence. On February 12, 1971, Gacy was charged with sexually assaulting a teenage boy. With financial assistance from his mother, Gacy bought a house in Norwood Park Township, an unincorporated area of Cook County. The address, 8213 West Summerdale Avenue, is where he resided until his arrest in December 1978 and where all his known murders were committed. In August 1971, Shortly after Gacy and his mother moved into the house, he became engaged to Carol Hoff, a divorcee with 2 young daughters. Hoff, whom he had briefly dated in high school, had been a friend of his younger sister. His fiancée moved into his home soon after the couple announced their engagement. Gacy's mother subsequently moved out of the house shortly before his wedding, which was held on July 1, 1972. 1 week before Gacy's wedding, on June 22, he was arrested and charged with aggravated battery and reckless conduct. The arrest was in response to a complaint filed by a youth named Jackie D., who informed police that Gacy, impersonating a police officer, had flashed a sheriff's badge, lured him into his car, and forced him to perform oral sex. Businessman and community volunteer. Following Gacy's marriage to Carol Hoff, his new wife and stepdaughters moved into the Summerdale Avenue house. Gacy with First Lady Rosalind Carter in 1978. 6 years after the killings began, a pin indicating Special Secret Service clearance is visible on his jacket. In 1973, Gacy and an employee of PDM Contractors traveled to Florida to view property Gacy had purchased. On the first night the two were alone in Florida, Gacy raped the youth in their hotel room. His neighbors in Norwood Park considered Gacy gregarious and helpful. He was active in his local community and hosted annual summer parties beginning in 1974. Gacy as Pogo the Clown. He stated that acting as a clown allowed him to regress into childhood. Through his membership in a local moose club, Gacy became aware of a Jolly Joker clown club whose members, dressed as clowns, would regularly perform at fundraising events and parades in addition to voluntarily entertaining hospitalized children. By 1975, Gacy had admitted to his wife that he was bisexual. First murders. Murder of Timothy Mccoy. On January 2, 1972, Gacy picked up 16-year-old Timothy Jack Mccoy from Chicago's Greyhound bus terminal. In an interview after his arrest, Gacy stated that immediately after killing Mccoy, he felt totally drained, yet noted that he had experienced a mind-numbing orgasm as he killed the youth. He added, "That's when I realized that death was the ultimate thrill." Quote. Second known victim. Gacy later stated that the second time he committed murder was around January 1974. The victim was an unidentified teenage youth with medium brown, curly hair estimated to be aged between 14 and 18 whom Gacy strangled. The handcuff trick and the rope trick. By 1975, Gacy's business was expanding rapidly. By his own later admission, he began working 12 and 16-hour days to fulfill agreed commitments upon an increasing number of contracts. Gacy also freely admitted that 1975 was also the year in which he began to increase the frequency of his excursions for sex with young males. Much of the labor workforce of PDM Contractors consisted of high school students and young men. One of these youths was a 15-year-old named Anthony Antonucci, whom Gacy had hired in May 1975. In July 1975, Gacy arrived at the youth's home while the youth was alone, having injured his foot at work the day prior. Gacy plied the youth with alcohol, wrestled him to the floor and cuffed Antonucci's hands behind his back. 1 week after the attempted assault on Antonucci, on July 29, 1975, another of Gacy's employees, 17-year-old John Butkovich, disappeared. The day before his disappearance, Butkovich had threatened Gacy over 2 weeks' outstanding back pay. Deceiving youths into donning handcuffs became Gacy's typical modus operandi in subduing his victims. After plying a youth with drink, drugs, or generally gaining his trust, Gacy would produce a pair of handcuffs, occasionally as part of a clowning routine. which he would persuade his intended victim into donning. With his victim manacled and unable to free himself, Gacy would then make a statement to the effect of, "The trick is, you have to have the key," before proceeding to rape and torture his captive. He would finish with the rope trick, placing a rope over his victim's neck and tying a makeshift tourniquet until the victim was strangled to death. Divorce. Following a heated argument regarding her failing to balance a PDM contractor's checkbook correctly in October 1975, although Gacy remained gregarious and civic-minded, several neighbors became aware of erratic changes in his behavior between his divorce in March 1976 and subsequent arrest in December 1978. This behavior included hearing his car arrive and depart in the early hours of the morning, noting lights switching on and off in his home at odd hours, and his keeping company with young males. Cruising years, 1976 to 1978. The majority of Gacy's murders were committed between 1976 and 1978, which he later referred to as his cruising years, now that he had his house to himself. 1 month after his divorce was finalized, Gacy abducted and murdered an 18-year-old youth named Daryl Sampson. Sampson was last seen alive in Chicago on April 6, 1976. 5 weeks later, on the afternoon of May 14, a 15-year-old named Randall Ruffett disappeared while walking home from Senn High School. The youth was gagged with a cloth. Victims Daryl Sampson and Gregory Godzik. Sampson was found buried beneath Gacy's dining room floor. Godzik was buried in the Crawlspace. On June 3, 1976, Gacy killed a 17-year-old Lakeview youth named Michael Bonin. He was reportedly last seen by 2 friends whom he had informed of his intentions to catch a bus to attend an interview with a construction firm. Bonin was strangled with a ligature and buried in the Crawlspace. On July 26, 1976, Gacy employed an 18-year-old named David Cram. On August 21, 2 further unidentified males are estimated to have been killed between August and October 1976. One of them was buried directly above the body of William Carroll, who had been murdered on June 13, yet higher than the body of a 17-year-old Bensonville youth named Rick Johnston, who was last seen on August 6. This particular unidentified male is estimated to have been aged between 21 and 27 years old, and sequential burial patterns of victims within the Crawlspace, plus the circumstantial fact that Cram had not lived with Gacy between the dates of August 6 and August 20, leave a possible date of between August 6 and August 20, 1976 as the time this particular man was murdered. The second unidentified male likely to have been murdered between August and October 1976 is a youth with dark brown hair, aged between 17 and 21 years old, who is known to have suffered from an abscessed tooth at the time of his murder. This male was buried in the northeast corner of the Crawlspace. Subsequent recollections by an employee of PDM contractors of a trench Gacy had ordered him to dig on or before October 5, 1976, being the location where this particular victim was buried, suggest a date between August and October 1976 as being when this man was murdered. On October 24, 1976, Gacy abducted and killed 2 teenage friends named Kenneth Parker and Michael Moreno. In December 1976, another PDM employee, 17-year-old Gregory Godzik, disappeared. He was last seen by his girlfriend outside her house, having driven her home following a date. A month later, on January 20, 1977, John Zyc, a 19-year-old acquaintance of Butkovich, Godzik and Gacy, disappeared. Zyc was lured to Gacy's house on the pretext of selling his Plymouth Satellite to Gacy. He was buried in Gacy's crawlspace directly above the body of Godsick. Between December 1976 and March 1977, Gacy is known to have killed an unidentified young man estimated to be around 25 years old. In March 1977, Gacy was hired as a construction supervisor for Pay Systems, a firm which specialized in the nationwide remodeling of drugstores. As a result of this contract, Gacy regularly traveled to other states to supervise construction projects, and he later stated that, through both businesses, PDM Contractors and Pay Systems, almost 80 buildings were successfully remodeled in 1977 alone. In April 1977, in August 1977, a clue emerged to the disappearance of John SZYC. Michael Rossi, who had bought Schick's car from Gacy, was arrested for stealing gasoline from a service station while driving the car. The attendant noted the license plate number and police traced the car to Gacy's house. Rossi had lived with Gacy until April 1977. In late 1977, Gacy began dating Carol Hoff. On October 17, a 21-year-old Minnesota youth named Russell Nelson disappeared. He was last seen outside a Chicago bar. Nelson died of suffocation and was also buried in the crawlspace. Less than 4 weeks later, a 16-year-old Kalamazoo youth named Robert Winch was murdered and buried in the crawlspace. And on November 18, a 20-year-old father of one named Tommy Bowling disappeared after leaving a Chicago bar. Both Winch and Bowling were strangled to death. 3 weeks after the murder of Tommy Bowling, a 19-year-old U.S. Marine named David Talsma disappeared on December 9 after informing his mother he was to attend a rock concert in Hammond. On December 30, 1977, Gacy abducted a 19-year-old student named Robert Donnelly from a Chicago bus stop at gunpoint. In March 1978, Gacy lured a 26-year-old named Jeffrey Rignall into his car. Upon entering the young man was chloroformed and driven to the house on Summerdale, where he was raped, tortured with various instruments including lit candles and whips, and repeatedly chloroformed into unconsciousness. Des Plaines River, the final murders. Gacy later confessed to police that he had initially considered stowing bodies in his attic, but had been worried of complications arising from excessive leakage, although only 4 of these 5 bodies were ever found. The first known victim thrown from the I-55 bridge into the Des Plaines River, 20-year-old Timothy O'Rourke, was killed in mid-June after leaving his apartment to purchase cigarettes. Investigation. On the afternoon of December 11, 1978, Gacy visited a Des Plaines pharmacy to discuss a potential remodeling deal with the owner of the store, Phil Torf. While Gacy was within earshot of a 15-year-old part-time employee named Robert Jerome Piest, he mentioned that his firm hired teenage boys. After Gacy left the store, Piest told his mother that some contractor wants to talk to me about a job. Piest left the store, promising to return shortly. When Piest failed to return, his family filed a missing person report on their son with the Des Plaines police. The owner of the pharmacy named Gacy is the contractor Piest had most likely left the store to talk with about a job. Gacy denied talking to Piest when Des Plaines police visited his home the following evening. Upon returning to the police station later that day, Gacy flatly denied any involvement in the disappearance of Robert Piest and repeated that he had not offered the youth a job. When asked why he had returned to the pharmacy at 8 p.m. on December 11, Gacy claimed he had done so in response to a phone call from Phil Torf informing him he had left his appointment book at the store. Detectives had already spoken with Torf, who had stated he had placed no such call to Gacy. Des Plaines police were convinced Gacy was behind Piest's disappearance and checked Gacy's record. discovering that he had an outstanding battery charge against him in Chicago and had served a prison sentence in Iowa for the sodomy of a 15-year-old boy. The following day, investigators received a phone call from Michael Rossi, who informed the investigators both of Gregory Godzik disappearance. On December 15, Des Plaines investigators obtained further details upon Gacy's battery charge, learning the complainant, Jeffrey Rignall, had reported that Gacy had lured him into his car, chloroformed him, raped him and dumped him, with severe chest and facial burns and rectal bleeding, in Lincoln Park the following morning. In an interview with Gacy's former wife the same day, they learned of the disappearance of John Butkovich. In an interview with Schick's mother the same day, she informed officers of the January 1977 disappearance of her son and that several items from his apartment were also missing, including a Motorola TV set. She added that investigators had informed her the month following his disappearance that her son had apparently sold his Plymouth Satellite to a John Gacy. Investigators noted that one of Gacy's employees, Michael Rossi, drove a similar car to Schick's. A check of the van confirmed the car driven by Rossi had belonged to SZYC. By December 16, Gacy was becoming affable with the surveillance detectives, regularly inviting them to join him for meals in various restaurants and occasionally for drinks in bars or his home. He repeatedly denied that he had anything to do with Feist's disappearance and accused the officers of harassing him because of his political connections or because of his use of recreational drugs. Knowing these officers were unlikely to arrest him on anything trivial, he openly taunted them by flouting traffic laws and succeeded in losing his pursuers on more than one occasion. On December 17, investigators conducted a formal interview of Michael Rossi, who informed them Gacy had sold Schick's vehicle to him with the explanation that he had bought the car from SZYC because the youth needed money to move to California. A further examination of Gacy's Oldsmobile was conducted on this date. In the course of examining the trunk of the car, the investigators discovered a small cluster of fibers which may have been human hair. These fibers were sent for further analysis. That evening, officers conducted a test using 3 trained German Shepherd search dogs to determine whether Feist had been present in any of Gacy's vehicles. That evening, Gacy invited 2 of the surveillance detectives to a restaurant for a meal. In the early hours of December 18, he invited the same officers into another restaurant where, over breakfast, he talked of his business, his marriages and his activities as a registered clown. At one point during this conversation, Gacy remarked to one of the 2 surveillance detectives, "You know, clowns can get away with murder." Quote, civil suit. By December 18, Gacy was beginning to show visible signs of strain as a result of the constant surveillance. He was unshaven, looked tired, appeared anxious and was drinking heavily. That afternoon, he drove to his lawyer's office to prepare a $750,000 civil suit against the Des Plaines police. The same evening, Michael Rossi was interviewed a second time. On this occasion, Rossi was more cooperative, informing detectives that in the summer of 1977, Gacy had had him spread 10 bags of lime in the crawl space of the house. On December 19, investigators began compiling evidence for a second search warrant of Gacy's house. The same day, Gacy's lawyers filed the civil suit against the Des Plaines police. The hearing of the suit was scheduled for December 22. That afternoon, Gacy invited 2 of the surveillance detectives inside his house. On this occasion, as one officer distracted Gacy with conversation, another officer walked into Gacy's bedroom in an unsuccessful attempt to write down the serial number of the Motorola TV set they suspected belonged to John SZYC. While flushing Gacy's toilet, this officer noticed a smell he suspected could be that of rotting corpses emanating from a heating duct. The officers who previously searched Gacy's house had failed to notice this, as on that occasion the house had been cold. Both David Cram and Michael Rossi were interviewed by investigators on December 20th. Rossi had agreed to be interviewed in relation to his possible links with John Szyc, whose vehicle investigators had established he drove, as well as the disappearance of Robert Piest. When questioned by Detective Joseph Kozenchak as to where he believed Gacy had placed Piest's body, Rossi replied, "In the crawlspace. He could have put him in the crawlspace." Quote, Cram himself informed investigators of Gacy's attempts to rape him in 1976 and stated that after he and Gacy had returned to his home after the December 13th search of his property, Gacy had turned pale upon noting a clot of mud on his carpet which he suspected had come from his crawlspace. Cram then stated Gacy had grabbed a flashlight and immediately entered the crawlspace to look for evidence of digging. When asked whether he had been to the crawlspace, Cram replied he had been asked by Gacy to spread lime down there and also dug trenches upon Gacy's behest, with the explanation they were for plumbing. Verbal confession. On the evening of December 20th, Gacy drove to his lawyer's office in Park Ridge to attend a pre-scheduled meeting he had arranged with them, ostensibly to discuss the progress of his civil suit. Upon his arrival, Gacy appeared disheveled and immediately asked for an alcoholic drink, whereupon Sam Amiranti fetched a bottle of whiskey from his car. Upon his return, Amiranti asked Gacy what he had to discuss with them. Gacy picked up a copy of the Daily Herald from Amiranti's desk. He pointed to a front-page article covering the disappearance of Robert Piest and informed his lawyers, "This boy is dead. He's in a river." Quote, over the following hours, Gacy gave a rambling confession that ran into the early hours of the following morning. He began by informing Amiranti and Stevens he had been the judge, jury and executioner of many people. The crawlspace at 8213 Summerdale. 26 victims were found buried in this location. 41, 58, 34, N87, 49, 57, W, 41, 97,619, N87, 832,421, W, 41, 97,619, minus 87, 832,421. Gacy later recollected his memories of his final day of freedom as being hazy, adding that he knew his arrest was inevitable and that, in his final hours of freedom, he intended to visit his friends and say his final farewells. After talking with Cram and Rossi at Cram's home, Gacy had Cram drive him to a scheduled meeting with Leroy Stevens. As he spoke with his lawyer, Cram informed the officers that Gacy had earlier divulged to both himself and Rossi that the previous evening, he had confessed to his lawyers his guilt in over 30 murders. Upon concluding his meeting with his lawyer, Gacy had Cram drive him to Mary Hill Cemetery, where his father was buried. As Gacy drove to various locations that morning, police outlined their formal draft of their second search warrant. The purpose of the warrant was specifically to search for the body of Robert Piest in the crawlspace. Upon hearing radioed reports from the surveillance detectives that, in light of his erratic behavior, Gacy might be about to commit suicide, police decided to arrest him upon a charge of possession and distribution of marijuana. Armed with the signed search warrant, police and evidence technicians quickly drove to Gacy's home. Upon their arrival, officers found that Gacy had unplugged his sump pump and that the crawlspace was flooded with water. To clear the water, they simply replaced the plug and waited for the water to drain. After it had done so, an evidence technician named Daniel Genti entered the 28 by 38 feet crawlspace. Arrest and confession. After being informed that the police had found human remains in his crawlspace and that he would now face murder charges, Gacy told officers he wanted to clear the air. In the early hours of December 22, 1978, Gacy confessed to police that since 1972, he had committed approximately 25 to 30 murders, all of whom he falsely claimed were of teenage male runaways or male prostitutes. Once back at Gacy's house, the victims would be handcuffed or otherwise bound, then sexually assaulted and tortured. To muffle his victims' screams, Gacy would often stick cloth rags or items of the victims' own clothing in their mouths. Some victims had been partly drowned in his bathtub before they had been revived, enabling Gacy to continue his prolonged assault. The victims were usually lured alone to his house, although on approximately 3 occasions, most victims were buried in Gacy's crawlspace, where he would periodically pour quicklime to hasten the decomposition of the bodies. When specifically questioned about Robert Piest, Gacy confessed to strangling the youth at his house on the evening of December 11 after luring him there, adding that he had been interrupted by a phone call from a business colleague while doing so. He also admitted to having slept alongside the youth's body that evening. Search for victims. Accompanied by police, Gacy returned to his house on December 22 and showed police the location in his garage where he had buried Butkovich's body. The police then drove to the spot on the I-55 bridge from which he had thrown the body of Piest and 4 other victims. Only 4 of the 5 victims Gacy claimed to have disposed of in this way were ever recovered from the Des Plaines River. Between December 22 and December 29, 1978, 27 bodies were recovered from Gacy's property. On March 9, the body of a 28th victim was found buried in a pit close to a barbecue grill in the backyard of the property. The victim was found wrapped within several plastic bags and wore a silver ring on the 4th finger of his left hand, indicating the possibility he had been married. 3 additional bodies, which had been found in the nearby Des Plaines River between June and December 1978, were also confirmed to have been victims of Gacy. Several bodies unearthed at Gacy's property were found with plastic bags over their heads or upper torsos. All the victims discovered at 8213 Summerdale were in an advanced state of decomposition, and the medical examiner chiefly relied upon dental records to facilitate the identification of the remains. 2 victims were identified because of their known connection to Gacy through PDM contractors. On April 9, 1979, a decomposed body was discovered entangled in exposed roots on the edge of the Des Plaines River, in Grundy County. Trial. Gacy was brought to trial on February 6, 1980, charged with 33 murders. At the request of his defense counsel, Gacy spent over 300 hours in the year before his trial with the doctors at the Menard Correctional Center. He underwent a variety of psychological tests. Gacy had attempted to convince the doctors that he suffered from a multiple personality disorder. The prosecutors presented a case that indicated Gacy was sane and fully in control of his actions. Immediately after Cram had completed his testimony, Michael Rossi himself testified for the state. When asked where he himself had dug in the crawl space, Rossi turned to a diagram of Gacy's home on display in the courtroom. This diagram showed where the bodies were found in the crawl space and elsewhere on the property. Rossi pointed to the location of the remains of an unidentified victim known as Body 13. Both Rossi and Cram also testified that Gacy would periodically look into the crawl space to ensure they or other employees ordered to dig trenches in the crawl space did not deviate from the precise locations he had marked. On February 18, Dr. Robert Stein, the Cook County medical examiner appointed to supervise the exhumation of the victims' bodies from Gacy's home, testified as to how he and his colleagues had conducted the recovery of the remains. Stein testified that the excavation was conducted in an archaeological fashion, adding that all the bodies recovered were markedly decomposed, putrefied, skeletalized remains. Upon cross-examination, Gacy's defense team attempted to raise the possibility that all 33 murders were accidental erotic asphyxia deaths. Dr. Stein countered this assertion with evidence that Gacy's claim was impossible. 3 days after the testimony of Dr. Robert Stein, Jeffrey Rignall testified on behalf of the prosecution, graphically recounting the abuse and torture he had endured at Gacy's hands in March 1978. Rignall repeatedly wept as he recounted his ordeal. In response to questioning relating to whether Gacy appreciated the criminality of his actions, Rignall stated his belief that Gacy was unable to conform his actions to the conduct of law, because of the beastly and animalistic ways he attacked me. On February 29, one of the youths Gacy had sexually assaulted in 1967, Donald Voorhees, testified to his ordeal at Gacy's hands, and that Gacy had subsequently paid another youth to beat him and spray mace in his face so he would not testify against him. Robert Donnelly testified the week after Voorhees, recounting his ordeal at Gacy's hands in December 1977. Donnelly was visibly distressed as he recollected the abuse he endured at Gacy's hands and came close to breaking down on several occasions. As the youth testified, Gacy repeatedly laughed at Donnelly's expense. During the 5th week of the trial, Gacy wrote a personal letter to Judge Garippo requesting a mistrial. Closing arguments. On March 11, final arguments from both prosecution and defense attorneys began, with the arguments concluding on the following day. Prosecuting attorney Terry Sullivan argued first, outlining Gacy's history of abusing youths, the testimony of his efforts to avoid detection and describing Gacy's surviving victims, Voorhees and Donnelly, as living dead. After the state's 4-hour closing, counsel Sam Amiranti argued for the defense. Amiranti argued against the testimony delivered by the doctors who had testified for the prosecution, repeatedly harking towards the testimony of the 4 psychiatrists and psychologists who had testified on behalf of the defense. Amiranti then urged the jury to put aside any prejudice they held against his client, and requested they deliver a verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity, adding that the psychology of Gacy's behavior would be of benefit to scientific research and that the psychology of his mind should be studied. William Kunkel, prosecutor at Gacy's trial, standing before a board depicting the 22 victims identified by February 1980. On the morning of March 12, the jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. The jury deliberated for more than 2 hours before they returned with their decision in the sentencing phase of the trial. Gacy was sentenced to death for the 12 counts of murder upon which the prosecution had sought this penalty. Death row. Upon being sentenced, Gacy was transferred to the Menard Correctional Center in Chester, Illinois, where he remained incarcerated on death row for 14 years. Isolated in his prison cell, Gacy began to paint. The subjects Gacy painted varied, although many were of clowns, some of which depicted himself as Pogo. Many of his paintings have been displayed at exhibitions. On February 15, 1983, Gacy was stabbed in the arm by Henry Brisbane, a fellow death row inmate known as the I-57 Killer. At the time of the attack, Gacy had been out of his cell participating in a voluntary work program when Brisbane ran towards Gacy and stabbed him once in the upper arm with a sharpened wire. A second death row inmate injured in the attack, William Jones, received a superficial stab wound to the head. Both Gacy and Jones received treatment in the prison hospital for their wounds. Appeals. After his incarceration, Gacy read numerous law books and then filed voluminous motions and appeals. Although he did not prevail in any, Gacy's appeals related to issues such as the validity of the first search warrant granted to Des Plaines Police on December 13, 1978, and his objection to his lawyer's insanity plea defense at his trial. Gacy also contended that, although he had some knowledge of 5 of the murders, those of Mccoy, Butkovich, Gudzik, Szyc and Piest, that the other 28 murders had been committed by employees who were in possession of keys to his house while he was away on business trips. In mid-1984, the Supreme Court of Illinois upheld Gacy's conviction and ordered that he be executed by lethal injection on November 14. The 1985 decision that he be executed was again appealed by Gacy, although his conviction was again upheld on September 29, 1988, with the Illinois Supreme Court setting a renewed execution date of January 11, 1989. After his final appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court was denied in October 1993, the Illinois Supreme Court set his execution date for May 10, 1994. Execution. On the morning of May 9, 1994, Gacy was transferred from the Menard Correctional Center to Stateville Correctional Center in Crest Hill to be executed. That afternoon, he was allowed a private picnic on the prison grounds with his family. For his last meal, Gacy ordered a bucket of Kentucky Fried Chicken, a dozen fried shrimp, French fries, fresh strawberries, and a Diet Coke. Before the execution began, the chemicals used to perform the execution unexpectedly solidified, clogging the IV tube administering the chemicals into Gacy's arm and complicating the execution procedure. Blinds covering the window through which witnesses observed the execution were drawn, and the execution team replaced the clogged tube to complete the procedure. After 10 minutes, the blinds were reopened and the execution resumed. The entire procedure took 18 minutes. According to published reports, Gacy was a diagnosed psychopath. In the hours leading up to Gacy's execution, a crowd estimated to number over 1,000. After Gacy's death was confirmed at 12:58 a.m. on May 10, 1994, his brain was removed. It is in the possession of Dr. Helen Morrison, a witness for the defense at Gacy's trial, who has interviewed Gacy and other serial killers in an attempt to isolate common personality traits of violent sociopaths. In the months following Gacy's execution, many of his paintings were auctioned. Victims. Identified victims. Only 25 of Gacy's victims were ever conclusively identified. By the time of Gacy's trial, a total of 22 victims had been identified. In March 1980, 2 further bodies unearthed from Gacy's Crawlspace were identified via dental and radiology records. In May 1986, unidentified victims. 7 victims remain unidentified, 6 of whom had been buried beneath Gacy's Crawlspace, with 1 additional youth buried approximately 15 feet from the barbecue pit in his backyard. Based upon Gacy's confession, information relative to where the victims were buried in his crawlspace relative to Gacy's identified victims, and forensic analysis, police were able to determine the most likely dates when his unidentified victims were killed. Facial reconstructions of the unidentified victims, released to the media in 1980, depicted left to right are body 5, body 9, later identified as Timothy Mccoy, body 24, body 19, later identified as William Bundy, body 21, body 28, body 13, body 26, and body 10. On October 11, 2011, Cook County Sheriff Thomas Dart announced that investigators, having obtained full DNA profiles from each of the unidentified victims, were to renew their efforts to identify all of them. At a press conference held to announce this intention, Sheriff Dart stated investigators are actively seeking DNA samples from individuals across the United States related to any male missing between 1970 and 1979. The 4 unrelated cold cases solved to date are those of 21-year-old Daniel Noe, who was last seen alive on September 30, 1978, and whose remains had been found near Mount Olympus in 2010. 16-year-old Stephen Soden, who was last seen alive April 3, 1972, in New Jersey and whose body was found in April 2000 in Burlington County. Identification dispute of Michael Moreno. In 2012, DNA tests conducted upon remains identified in 1980 through dental analysis as those of Michael Moreno revealed that the remains had been misidentified. Moreno's mother had always doubted the identification of her son because clothing found upon the body was inconsistent with what her son had worn when she last saw him. In addition, the dental X-ray conducted upon the victim identified as Michael Moreno had revealed the victim had all of his second molars, whereas a dental X-ray conducted upon Moreno in March 1976 revealed one molar had not erupted. Nonetheless, the orthodontist who had identified Moreno's remains has stated his conviction in the accuracy of his findings, adding he had compared 32 teeth. Probably half a dozen of them had very distinct fillings and every one of them was consistent with Michael Moreno. Quote, the original misidentification of the body identified as Michael Moreno has been disputed because neither an upper nor a lower jawbone was present upon the exhumed body, or the possibility both youths had been misidentified. Kenneth Parker's relatives have refused to submit to DNA testing. Possible additional victims. At the time of Gacy's arrest, he had claimed to both Des Plaines and Chicago investigators that the total number of victims he had killed could be as high as 45. On May 8, 1977, a 24-year-old named Charles Hatula was found drowned in a river near Freeport, Illinois. Gacy stated that after he had assaulted and then released Jeffrey Rignall in March 1978, he had begun to throw his murder victims into the Des Plaines River. He confessed to having disposed of 5 bodies in this manner. However, only 4 bodies were recovered from the river and conclusively confirmed to be victims of Gacy. Given the gap of over 4 months between the dates of the murders of the first and second victims, known to have been disposed in the river, it is possible that this unknown victim may have been killed between June and November 1978. A retired Chicago police officer named Bill Dorsch. In March 2012, Cook County Sheriff's officials submitted a request to excavate the grounds of this property. However, the Cook County State's attorney denied this request, stating a lack of probable cause as the reason the submission was denied, including the previous 1998 search. A second request to excavate the grounds of West Miami Avenue was submitted to the Cook County State's attorney by Sheriff Tom Dart in October 2012. This request was granted in January 2013, and a search of the property was conducted in the spring. Both FBI sniffer dogs and ground-penetrating radar equipment were used in the second search of West Miami Avenue. However, the search yielded no human remains. Some parties have questioned the integrity and thoroughness of the second search conducted of West Miami Avenue. Inspiration for the Missing Child Recovery Act of 1984. In 1984, Sam Almirante, one of Gacy's 2 defense attorneys at his 1980 trial, authored the Missing Child Recovery Act of 1984. Almirante has since stated that the primary inspiration for this legislation was the fact that at the time of the Gacy murders, there had been a 72-hour period which police in Illinois had to allow to elapse before initiating A search for a missing child. Potential accomplices and connections. One of the first things Gacy told investigators after his arrest was that he had not acted alone in several of the murders. He questioned whether individuals he referred to as my associates had also been arrested. Gacy specifically named 2 employees of PDM contractors as being the individuals he had referred to as being involved in several of the murders. Jeffrey Rignall, who had been assaulted and tortured by Gacy in March 1978, was adamant that at one point during his abuse and torture, the young man with brown hair, kneeling before him, watched his abuse. Moreover, on one occasion during the surveillance of Gacy prior to his arrest, 2 of the surveillance officers followed Gacy to a bar. Gacy had driven to meet 2 of his employees. At the bar, the surveillance officers overheard a hushed conversation between Gacy and one of his employees in which the youth asked Gacy the question, "And what?" buried like the other 5. Quote, in interviews following his arrest and conviction, Gacy repeatedly claimed that he was not present in Chicago when 16 of the identified victims had disappeared. In one interview, he stated that at the time of his arrest, 4 PDM employees were also considered suspects in the disappearances of the missing individuals investigators had linked to Gacy, all of whom he stated were in possession of keys to his house. Later investigations. In 2012, 2 Chicago lawyers named Stephen Becker and Robert Stevenson. Investigators also note that Robert Young, the traveling companion with whom victim Russell Nelson was visiting Chicago at the time of his disappearance in October 1977, gave differing accounts of the youth's disappearance to both Nelson's family and investigators. To Nelson's family, Young had stated Nelson failed to arrive at a bar at a prearranged time. To investigators, Young claimed he had last seen Nelson standing among a crowd who had gathered outside a Chicago bar, and when his, Young's, attention was diverted for a few moments, Nelson simply disappeared. Investigators contend this could not have happened without his traveling companion noticing. Young is known to have filed a missing persons report with Chicago police before unsuccessfully requesting money from Nelson's parents to finance a search for their son. When Nelson's 2 brothers arrived in Chicago to search for their missing brother, Young offered both brothers a job with Gacy's construction company. In a third case, travel records indicate Gacy was at a scheduled job site in Michigan at 6 a.m. on September 26, 1977, the day following the disappearance of a 19-year-old youth named John Mowry. Mowry was last seen leaving his mother's house at 10 p.m. on September 25. Criminal defense attorneys and investigators researching the possibility Gacy had not acted alone in several of the murders have stated there is overwhelming evidence Gacy worked with an accomplice. Media. Film. The made-for-TV film To Catch a Killer, starring Brian Dennehy as Gacy, was released in 1992. The film is largely based on the investigation of Gacy, following the disappearance of Robert Piest, by Des Plaines police and their efforts to arrest him before the scheduled civil suit hearing on December 22. A feature film, Gacy, was released in 2003. This film cast Mark Holton in the role of Gacy and depicts Gacy's life after he moved to Norwood Park in 1971 up until his arrest in 1978. The made-for-TV film Dear Mr. Gacy was released in 2010, starring William Forsythe as Gacy. The film is based upon the book The Last Victim, written by Jason Moss. The film focuses upon the correspondence between Moss and Gacy before Gacy invited Moss to visit him on death row in 1994. The horror film 8213, Gacy House was released in 2010 and is based upon paranormal investigators spending a night in the house built on the former site of 8213 Summerdale Terrace. Books. Killer Clown. The John Wayne Gacy Murders. By Terry Sullivan and Peter T. Mikan. ISBN 0-7860-14229. The Last Victim. A True-Life Journey into the Mind of the Serial Killer. By Jason Moss and Jeffrey Kotler. Ph.D. ISBN 0-7535-03980. Unfinished Nightmare. The Search for More Victims of Serial Killer John Wayne Gacy. By Chris Malone. ISBN 978-1466080317. Television. The Discovery Channel has broadcast an episode relating to Gacy's crimes within the true crime series The New Detectives, Case Studies and Forensic Science. This documentary features an interview between Gacy and FBI profiler Robert Ressler, whom Gacy claimed to have known when both he and Ressler were children. As a child, Ressler had lived just 4 blocks from Gacy in Chicago, and Gacy had delivered groceries to Ressler's family. The investigation Discovery Channel has broadcast 2 documentaries about the Gacy murders. The first documentary, focusing upon Gacy's crimes, was commissioned for the Most Evil series, a forensics program in which a forensic psychiatrist named Michael Stone analyzes various murderers and psychopaths. The second investigation Discovery program on Gacy is featured in the Devil You Know series. This program explores how Gacy's actions affected his family. Gacy's sister and niece are among those interviewed. The television program Psychic Investigators has broadcast an episode entitled What Lies Below.